All right, hey everybody. Thanks for joining the stream today. We're going to do some live development and a show and tell for the simplytest.me project. I'll kick off by starting that if you're not familiar with simplytest.me, it is a project that lets you demo Drupal sites. So you're able to pick different project names, and then configure various options, and then launch a sandbox, and you'll get a fully installed and running Drupal site so you can do some testing. A lot of folks do this for testing patches and various bug report testing, so that way they don't need a local environment. It's been a staple of the Drupal community for some time now, and I believe 2 years ago or something like that, Adam took over maintainership and has been working on a new version. Part of that new version update was to switch from the bespoke backend to now it's leveraging Tugboat QA. So for those who aren't familiar with Tugboat, it is a service that helps you build on-demand previews, and you do a little bit of configuration and you get an environment available. Okay, almost 3 years. And Tugboat graciously donates their backend infrastructure for simplytest.me, which helped remove a lot of the maintenance burden for maintaining simplytest.me. But it's still a Drupal 7 site, and adding features is a bit hard. So there's been an effort to get it updated to Drupal 8 and now Drupal 9, and that's where I've been able to come in. Over the holidays, Adam reached out to me and asked if I want to do some sponsored development to get this next version over the hump, to help him out with his maintenance burden of having to maintain the Drupal 7 version and then get this new one out. That's a lot for one person to handle. And simplytest.me does have an open collective where organizations and individual users have contributed funds, and we're able to use those funds to get the new version up and running, at least almost to an alpha stage, which is what I'm going to show off right now, and do a little bit of live development to fix a few things that remain from the initial port. We are at a point, this is like a donation plug right here. We are at a point where the budget has closed out basically any sponsored time, but I'm having my company, Bluehorn Digital, essentially sponsor my own development time to do this, because I feel that simplytest.me is a critical part of the Drupal community and a necessary tool in all of our contribution sprints that happen at conferences. So I want to see this happen. So this is what the existing site looks like. If I were to if I wanted to try out the password policy module, does a little reload, I get all the versions, and then I am then able to add additional modules. One of the requests folks have had is to be able to specify the version of the additional project. You're also able to add patches, as I said before, but you can only add patches for the root project. Folks have wanted to be able to say, I want this patch to apply to the additional project, which makes it a lot easier to test some bugs. Because it's like, okay, we have this module that actually is broken by a dependency that needs this patch. It allows people to create a test environment fairly easily without having to set it up all locally. So this is the existing site, and we're going to close this and head over to the new one now. This is a local version that I have running, which props to DDEV, because I have my local environment powered by DDEV. So there are some kinks still in here, and the user interface is obviously not as fleshed out and themed, because instead of trying to make it look pretty, went for just getting it to work. So if we try again for the password policy, so we'll go in here, you can pick password policy. This needs to get fixed where it's showing it in reverse, but we can go ahead. Actually, one thing I want to show. So if I go and pick 7.15, if I give it a minute, it actually updated to the Drupal 7 versions. If I go to a Drupal 8 version, this will go to 8.94. This is slow because we don't cache the Drupal core releases inside SimplyTest. They're actually fetching it from the Drupal.org API on demand. And that's what this issue right here handles is we should maintain a local cache of Drupal core releases, and it's going to make that form go a lot faster and make it a few more version compatibility checks a lot easier. So we can do that. You're able to add patches. If we wanted to add an additional project, the autocomplete isn't as up to snuff in the new version as it is in the current site. But if I would just quick pick this one, as you can see, it doesn't do version constraints. This has a 7.x release. When this is Drupal 8, we do have an issue for that. But I just want to show that we are able to add patches for each additional project. So I'm going to quick remove that there. And we'll go through. Oh, and here's a new one too, that we're able to pick the installation profile. Since this is a Drupal 8 site, we can pick the umami demo. So if you wanted to test something and what it looks like in a site with full content, you would do so. I'll pick that since some folks may not know what the umami demo looks like. So I'm going to click Launch Sandbox. And what it's doing in the background is generating a configuration for Tugboat and saying, hey, can you create a preview for me? And we'll get a bit of a live log that's going on here. It does not auto scroll. That is one thing I want to get added. But while that runs, I'm just going to go through some of the issues I want to tackle today. So we have a really basic JSON endpoint that's used for when you click launch, it posts JSON and it handles that. But if we try to return an array of error messages, it gets embedded into a sub array. It gets kind of weird just due to how Drupal handles exceptions when the route is for JSON. So we actually have to borrow what the JSON API module has done to ensure that we can return an array of error messages. So that's one thing I want to get. That helps make the front end a little bit simpler and give better error messages if something goes wrong. I want to check on this. So as you can see, it does a basic status in the way that this figures it out. Let's see if I can find the marker. So it's doing the composer install. So here's the stage of SimplyTest stage patching. That's used to mark it as being at about 75%. And now it's at finalize. Sorry, finalize is about like 75, 80%. And once this finishes, it's going to give us a URL. It'll say 100% and redirect us. I just want to keep this open for the last bit. So yeah, so one of the issues is better error handling when there is an error launch in the SimplyTest instance. We need to validate that all patch URLs come from Drupal.org or git.drupalcode.org. All right, so this instance launched, we get the little message. It did not install umami, so that's a bug. I'm going to quick open that. So it should have installed with the umami demo, but it did not. Selecting the umami demo, still install standard. Just want to open this quick so you can capture it. Selected the umami demo and it did not install, but instead we got standard. All right. I wouldn't be surprised by that because we recently refactored how previews are generated, or the config for previews, and I probably caused a regression there. So that's my own fault. We actually have tests for this, so we can probably add this to the list as a quick fix and do a little bit of test-driven development for that. But, so just to show, so now we have an environment at tugboat.qa. If I log in as admin, admin, and I go to, no. So if I were to go to extend, and if I search for password, we now have the password policy, and the password policy module is installed, and we can install all the different contrib, and this lets us go through and configure and play around with the password policy. So if you're curious about this module, but you don't want to install it locally, you can try it out here. So the default is just password reset days of 30. And ta-da. Oh, so next. So we've now been able to go through here. And it kind of shows you that with password policy, you need to install a bunch of these extra to add constraints because they're additional modules instead of being just plugins on it. So that's that. So now we'll get into some of the actual bug fixing at hand. Let me get back to my dev site. All right, so I'm actually really curious about this demo, this umami demo. Oh shoot, did I unfreeze? I hope I unfroze. All right. So we're going to figure out why the umami demo was not selected. If I go into the code, we have the simply test tugboat module. And we actually have a series of tests. But before I go into the tests, I want to show this preview config generator. So this preview config generator takes an array of parameters and then uses it to generate a JSON blob that gets passed to Tugboat for defining how the preview should look. So our problem here is somewhere in this git installing commands. So we'll go into this right here. And it checks if that checkbox for perform install is checked. If it's not, it skips this. So the install profile defaults to standard. And if it's a distro, we change the distro to be based on the project. But it looks like right here we're missing where the umami demo might be selected. So I'm going to go into the launch and go to controller. And in here, this is where we invoke this launch instance based on the submission. Actually, sorry. The controller calls this, and then we do some massaging of the submission to get passed into the preview config generator. And where do we respect the install profile? I'm actually not seeing it in there. So maybe this got added to the front end UI, but was not actually respected in the end. So let's look at the launch instance. So one thing that the SimplyTest module uses is it uses Core's typed data API. And the typed data API just lets you say that it's like prop types in React, where you say this object has these properties that have this schema. So if we look at the instance launch definition, we're saying that this object has a project key that is a project info definition. It has a Drupal version key, and that is a string. And we're able to add constraints such as the Drupal version cannot be blank, and it needs to be the primitive type, which says if you passed a number or anything that's not a string, it will throw an error and that it is required. Okay, here we go. So we have install profile, data definition as a string, and it should be not blank and primitive type. So we have the install profile here, but for some reason we are not passing it to the parameters that are being passed to Tugboat. And If this seems a little bit fragmented, that's because it is. I started working on it without trying to change too much at once because it would be too hard to grok where something broke. So in the end, we will normalize this launch definition into what's passed to the instance manager that gets passed to the preview config. So that way there's less of this, code that kind of massages the source values to the destination. So I'm going to do, in here, we'll say install profile. Or first, let's do some test-driven development instead. We'll pick the Drupal 9 config just to do that. So the test here goes through a base config, which does a setup, and in it, it gets the generated config for the test and then asserts it equals. So it takes the expected configuration and checks it against what we generate from the parameters. And all the tests use this base class and have to implement config data. So all the meat and potatoes are in the actual test class, and this test method, which returns an array of configuration and then the expected output. So let's collapse some of these. Perform install there. We're going to copy this one and test specifying the install profile parameter. We're going to paste that, and we're going to say it should say install profile is umami demo, because that is the correct name for it, I believe. Just check. Oh, it's demo umami. All right. So now go here, and we're going to check the expected output. So in our expected output, when we do drush site install, we are going to expect this to be demo umami. And now we will run the test. And luckily this is a unit test instead of Drupal's. So Drupal has 3 PHP unit test suites: unit, kernel, and functional. Everything's broken. So unit is just like a regular PHP unit test. Kernel allows you to do some bootstrapping of the Drupal database. Functional test lets you test a fully installed Drupal site with a emulated browser. And then I forgot, functional JavaScript does fully installed Drupal site with a Chrome driver or other web driver instance and not a browser emulator. Okay, why is this broken? Oh, looks like the tests just in general are out of date. So let me quick fix that. So one bummer is Drupal.org does not run Drupal CI for profiles. So if I break tests, I don't know it until I run them locally again. And there are reasons for that Drupal.org does not run tests for profiles. Cannot remember them off the top of my head, but it's no big problem. We can fix this quickly. It's part of it. We had an issue where the previous code was calling drush as dev, and then it wasn't installing, or I refactored it and prevented it from, and then it stopped installing. So I had to remove that flag. All right, why is this one calling? So before patching, it's calling this. All right. Let me just get this updated. I'll run the test again as I go. And there. All right, that should be it. data providers in PHP-Unit are really cool, but sometimes it starts to get really big and you start to lose track of, oh, so why isn't it for test 2? Sorry. 1, 0, 1, 2. This says that it does not exist for distros. So there is an existing bug with Simply Test where install profiles and distros do not work. I think I know how we can fix it, but I preserve that brokenness, so that way we can test it and fix it properly. So that's why that probably failed when I tried to add the missing command. Great, so now we're at a point where our new test data is failing. Let's make sure it's, all right, so here we go. So we were expecting it to be demo umami, but instead we're getting standard. So we have our tests were green, we added a change, and we're not green anymore. That's test-driven development. And now we're going to work on the fix to get that test to be green without causing any regressions. So we know that our submission instance will have an install profile. Value, so we'll do submission. And just in case, actually, launch. Is that marked required? Yes, it is required. Okay. So we don't need to give a default value because it should not come through without a value. So we now have it in the parameters that are sent. So now we'll go to our config, to here, parameters, and then we'll do else. Actually, oh, I even have the to do there. Wow, I didn't realize that first. So parameters, install profile. So we can delete that line. We have install profile. Let's click run. And our test should be green. Oh, there's an error. Undefined index help is the test data. Standard. All right. So we will add that to all of the tests. 0, 1, 2. Okay. So that's good that our test crashed, but it shows that we had invalid data being passed as the parameters because we expect it to be validated. One way we could actually fix that, and I'm going to do that right now, is if, no, I'm not going to. So what I wrote this test wrong. What I should have done for this test is it should have provided the data that would be passed to a launch definition and then run validation against that. But that's a lot to refactor in this call when I want to work on fixing bugs versus what's quote unquote right or wrong. So we have this going. I broke all the other tests. So I'm going to change this to be tugboat unit tests. And I'm going to go through and fix up the Drupal 7 config test. So in here, I'll need to that, paste it there. Oh, I don't want to add it here because it's a distribution. Well, I'll add it there as default, just whatever. Paste it into there. Okay, so now we just need to fix the Drupal 8 test. Again, just paste that in here. So this is why it's extremely valuable to write tests, even if it's for something small. Well, I guess this isn't small. This is big feature. But just something that takes in data and expects to generate something, write a test for it. It doesn't take much time. this did, because it was a lot of, a lot of writing an array and copying these in, but it gives you some sanity and comfort in knowing that things work into some expected way, and you can go back and find ways to optimize. I realize that Simply Test has some things where it does compose require with no update, and then later on does install, which actually found out doing this doesn't respect changes to the lock file done here. So there's things that can be optimized by after you write a test and kind of see how things work. So we have the test screen. What I'm going to do now is create an issue fork for this issue. For those who haven't seen issue forks before, it's new to Drupal.org. I did a live stream over the summer, I believe, when it was like in beta and opt-in. It's improved a lot since then, and now it's enabled for every single project. So I've created an issue fork, and this lets you do merge requests, just like you would do a pull request in GitHub or a merge request in GitLab without having to go to the backend GitLab instance. Everything has commands on Drupal.org. So if I'm going to click Show Commands, and I'm going to copy this set, which adds the fork local repo. So see web profiles, simply test. So this is my simply test repo. I just paste the commands. It added the fork for me, and now I can check out the branch that was created. There we go. And if I do a quick git diff, has our changes. Fix, selecting the install profile. So now I can push it up, and I can click open merge request here. So I created the merge request. See if I refresh this, if it shows any new comments. It says I opened it, and this merge request is now opened, and we could do like a code review here if we wanted to. And just to help show how this looks, for those who aren't familiar with the code review or how using merge requests in here, oops, I should have done this a while ago. So I'm going to add my comment. And now if I go back over to the issue and refresh it, with issue forks, it will actually pull in the comments. So that way, if folks are doing code review here, you see the comments bubble up here. Because for one thing that I love about the Drupal contribution workflow is that issues have the code and communication in one area versus the issue and then the pull request. It's still a bit fragmented, but all things considered, this is a pretty amazing way to incorporate what makes Drupal great for contribution and collaboration with modern workflows. So I'm going to put this to needs review so that way Adam can review it later on. And then for those who are maintainers, there's actually a button under here that says merge the merge request. So maintainers don't even need to go to GitLab. They get to merge it. They just go to GitLab to review the code. So woohoo, we got one bug that is fixed on this call. Next, I want to go fix this validation exceptions on launcher. And the best way to showcase this is, I want to get back to my main branch, I think by just performing a mock request. So I have in here, great. So I know a lot of people like to use Postman or Insomnia, or I know there's now Postwoman. I like to use the HTTP client built into PHP Storm. And one reason I really like it is because you can write scratches that you can relaunch and have multiple requests in here. So the issue that we're facing is that if, let me show the code before I get too ahead of myself. So I want to fix the error where if an invalid launch instance payload is sent, that we get a decent error message back. And that error message is generated in this launch module's controller. I'll show you the route definition first. The route definition says that launch project, it only supports the post method, and the format will be in JSON. Drupal allows you to specify the format for routes. This is part of the Symfony routing system. And when you set the format to JSON, Drupal will always return the response in JSON. It will convert it. So in here, we have the launch project, and what it will do is it gets the payload from the request, it decodes it into a submission object, and then tries to validate it. In this validate submission, we actually take the payload and tell the typed data manager to create an instance launch data object from it. If there's any errors with that, it gets the message and returns it, and then it runs Symfony's validation constraints. And if there are any validation constraints, that's when it throws a new unprocessable entity, and we have this weird workaround. And I'll show you why we JSON API. So if we go to default exception subscriber, so what happens is this default exception subscriber will automatically return the data. Yeah, so it takes our error message and then sets it as a message object, serializes it, and returns it. So we need to replace this subscriber for our request, basically, is what needs to happen. JSON API has done this already. Subscriber, exception JSON subscriber. Oh, maybe it's in here that it's happening. Either way, it's getting mangled, and I'll show you what it looks like when it's mangled. So we're going to leave out the Drupal version, and if I run this request, accept, we got back a message that with a collection of errors that this value should not be blank. So if I were to return it, let me do this without encoding the array so you can see what happens. One, it doesn't accept an array. The default class requires a message, and to work around this, the core JSON API module has its own class. And we're not using JSON API here, so we have to basically copy it. So in here, we create our own unprocessable exception, or they do, and the construct receives the exception, and then you're able to set the violations on it. This receives entity constraint, so it's actually a layer above where we're working, where it assumes that you're working with entities and not just generic constraints. So I'm going to leave this open, but we're going to make our own version of it. Do directory exception. We'll do unprocessable entity HTTP exception. Actually, just be way easier if I copy and paste this and make sure I rename it the right way. And we'll change this to simply test launch. JSON API. And we need to change this to be validate it returns a constraint validation list interface, not just one for entities. Which I wonder if we can make a pull request for core to have this exception handler change so that way it's reusable by other modules. Right. So we now have our exception there. So we're going to change this to be from Symfony kernel. Let's delete that. I'll scroll back to here. We're going to import. Oh, shoot. It didn't do. Oh, it's renamed. It's named differently. Unprocessed HTTP. Okay. So we're going to delete that. We'll rename this to be unprocessable HTTP any constraint. We don't want to throw it right away. So we do exception equals new that, throw exception, and we're going to do exception set violations to be the constraints. Let's see if that gets us to where we need to go. I'm going to assume no, because we probably need more. So we only got a message back. There's more to it inside the JSON API module, where event subscriber, they do the default exception subscriber, where they set the response based on, they don't in here. Where they do it is it's actually a normalizer. Sorry, so they don't override it too much. Entity X. So here's their normalizer where they take all the errors and convert it to be for the JSON API spec. We don't need to do quite as much, but we'll want to copy what something like what the serialization module does. Actually, let's see what is running right now. So the JSON API, serialization, HTTP exception, subscriber base. All right. So I don't know what is exactly running right here. So we're going to look at this here. I'm going to set a breakpoint. And in serialization, I'm pretty sure we don't have the serialization module installed. This just happens to be here. And I'm going to turn on xdebug. Okay, xdebug's enabled. Flip on the listener. And I'm going to run the request again. And what it should do now is it's going to catch us. Okay, so we know that it is in the core event subscriber, and what it does here is it gets the exception and it generates a response this way. So what we need to do is create another subscriber that just runs faster than this. So let's go through and create a new event subscriber. Now, normally I probably like this code kind of feels weird going into the launch because it's like laying some groundwork API stuff, but you know, their module structure is there. I want to try to respect it and kind of keep things where they belong, and later on we can refactor things to where it might be more appropriate. Just because I like to try to keep changes succinct instead of like, well, if I'm going to add this, I'm going to refactor everything around and change it. causes too much noise. So what should we name this? We'll just call it exception JSON subscriber as well. I'll do the namespace of Drupal simply test. Wants to give me every other project. Extends, what is that? HTTP. What? We'll just extend this. And let's rename this actually to be what do we call it? Unprocessable. There. Rename it. We're going to simplify the qualified name, and we'll do we'll override the on for XX. What do we got going on here? So event, we can get the exception from here. So if exception is instance of, if this is our exception, we will handle it. Otherwise, we will fall back to the parent. So that's weird. Why does Cord copy this in 2 spots instead of just putting it up ahead? All right, so we know that we can call this, we can change, oh, subscriber, no, we want there we go. That's the right class. So if the exception is an instance of our class, we're going to go ahead and change the response. Let's get this formatted. Oh, why is it not? All right. So we wanted to keep the root message, but we're going to say errors. And in this, we'll do exception get violations. We don't need to get the throwable here because we already have get message. Let's go to the subscriber base here, and now we need to add a services file. Simply test launch.services.yaml. Paste that here. So we're going to do exception. We'll call this unprocessable HTTP JSON, and there we go. I'll go to that. And we're going to override the priority here, which I believe that is exactly what the JSON API module did. Or it took it plus 25, we'll do the same thing. And we'll override the handled formats to be just JSON. We don't care about all the others. There. So go to that. We now have our service defined. I get this, if you use PHP Storm and you're wondering how I have this cog, it is due to the, let me open my plugins, to the Symfony support plugin and the Drupal Symfony bridge. So these are a lifesaver for my productivity on a day-to-day basis. So I highly recommend adding those. So now I'm going to clear my cache, ddiv-cr. And by doing a cache rebuild, it causes the service container to recompile, which means that it will now know that I have this event subscriber. Might take a little bit because I do have xdebug running. There we go. All right. So I'll turn this back on, and I'm going to drop a breakpoint here to make sure that we're listening. And I'm going to run this once more. All right, we're in our class. We have our exception. We have our response, the data. So we'll see here that errors is an empty object. And that's because we cannot normalize the values that were passed in. So even if we go to this response, we'll see that the errors was an empty array. So we need to go back to our previous code, and I want to copy that messages bit. So what this code does is, let me get the warning out of the way. So it does an array map on the very violations, and the violations is an iterator. So we do iterator to array, an array map, and take the property path with the violation message, so you can know, okay, I have an array of errors, it's at this property path, what was the error, and process that to the front end. So now that we've changed that, let's click play again. Oh, shoot, that's for the tests. We don't want the tests. Let me run this again. So if we step through, we now get our messages array. I'll say Drupal version should not be blank and should not be null. It will now set that as a response. So here's our request, and our response is now, here's the message, validation failed. Errors, we got 2 errors on the Drupal version, which is expected because I removed it. So now if I were to do Drupal version 7.77, it will pass. Yep, so we're in here where it's building out all the different commands. I'm going to stop it so I don't create an extra instance. So that fixes our error messages. And where we use these are in the React app. But first, I want to get this code up to Drupal.org as like the baseline. And then we'll get the React app to handle those. So I'm going to create an issue fork. Completing it. Once again, I'm going to copy the commands. I'm just going to open the merge request up first. So if you open the merge request first, and then you make commits, those commits will show up as comments. So let me just review. So add in subscriber, we're fixing that there. We added our new subscriber. We added the exception that we can leverage. Okay. And support returning violations as array of strings. So now we can push it. And it actually, and GitLab, when you do pushes, returns the link to the merge request. It would actually be interesting if we can open a feature to modify this to return the Drupal.org issue it's for. I'm going to go on a side quest real quick. I guess I actually have no... There we go. It's this issue queue. So if you want to open issues for the issue forks, the Drupal.org queue for the community projects is the best way to do that. I don't know if there's an issue for that already, but on push to GitLab issue, on push to issue fork, change remote messages from link from the link to the merge request to the issue feature request. There is actually a component for the GitLab integration, so if you want to find issues about it or open one, you can specify it is for the GitLab integration. And pushing to a fork, or when pushing to a branch that has a GitLab always returns the link to that. It'd be super cool if we could modify that to return a link to the issue on Drupal.org. All right, there. Open that up. I think that'd be a cool feature to get added. It's not completely necessary, but would be pretty awesome. Push this. So here I pushed that commit and it added the information here. So that way you can do like a quick click and see. So it gives you like the inner diff. Basically, I know everybody's used to having to like create patches and then review inner diffs. When you push, it does link to the individual commits. So that way you can see what changed between them. All right, so let's look at the React code now. So this front end is a React application, and we're going to update its handling of the errors now that we've fixed that. So it actually lives within the theme under the lib directory. It's not create React app or anything too fancy like that. In fact, it's not very separated at all. It's one big happy file. So we have the launcher, the on submit, and if we have errors, it's actually not even bubbling up the errors right now. So let's see if we can get some errors to pop up. So we'll go into the theme. And we're using Laravel Mix to do live reloading and browser sync, which allows us to, kind of have the same feel of create React app, not. Oh, cool. Here's a message. Is there an extension to South PHP Storm that helps with React development? I don't think so. I think it's got a lot out of the box just because PHP Storm and WebStorm are basically the same thing. Just WebStorm doesn't ship with PHP support. Let me look at my plugins real quick. So just PHP stuff, plenty of PHP stuff that I've added. Deployment. Oh, JavaScript frameworks and tools. So yeah, I think it just has, like, with the JavaScript and TypeScript bundled support, React is just there. This is all bundled. Yep, I don't think there's anything fancy with it. Maybe just under languages and support, there's JavaScript, and then in libraries, when it detects the node modules, it will detect what's there. You can also then enable specific libraries. Like if it's not detected, you could add the types for it, and that will help do autocomplete. I didn't really have to configure much. It usually can just determine things fairly well out of the box. Like if I were to click git launch payload, it doesn't detect that it's actually a function from the context. Maybe WebStorm has some configuration changes, make it a little bit easier. I'm not sure. But for the most part, it just works. So I want to test issues here. Oh, first, let's get this running. So my package.json. So we have a watch. So I'm going to run watch. And I like to run things with the npm runner inside of PHP Storm because it keeps my terminal free. And I'm really good at having a terminal open and then closing out of the tab, which then kills whatever process is running. So this way it's got its own little dedicated bit, and I'm not prone to accidentally killing the process. So I want to, after this runs, I'll show you what it enables us to do. And this keeps going. So it does use Tailwind. So if we modify our Tailwind post CSS file, it will run. Updates for our styling. Okay, great. So, no, don't open Chrome. Don't open Chrome. What we're going to do, instead of opening localhost, we're actually going to take this URL here and append 3000 to it. And we have browser sync connected. So, this is one where I'm going to drag PHP Storm off site real quick and make a change so that way I know you can't see me make a change right now, but just want to show what this provides. So one thing I noticed is I still have it logging right here. So I'm actually going to delete that and save. And now it's doing the reload because source files changed and the console's deleted. Or here, I'll bring it back. I'm changing the D to lowercase. And then it detected a file change and it reloaded for me. So it helps out a little bit as you make changes in the background and you want things to deploy. This is set up to also monitor. So Laravel Mix is like a wrapper around Webpack. And what this will do is it compiles the app.js and then Tailwind. And it watches for any changes to Tailwind, to the simplytest.theme, and any templates in the theme, and any templates changes to the modules that are part of simplytest. But what we want to do is I want to throw an error. So this git launch payload combines the entire state of the app and returns the JSON that should be sent over. I'm going to comment out the Drupal version. So if I were to do password policy again, oh, it's going to reload. I'll just do password confirm. To the network tab. So if I click launch sandbox, so there's an error. This was like the escape hatch I had to do because there wasn't a good way to grok any of the errors. But we now have them here. So we can go back to this code. I'm going to launcher. There was an error. So now the good part is to figure out where that happened on line 181. Okay, so great. There was an error. This is not a great error message. We need to come up with something better. We'll do. So we can add alerts to this. We'll do. We're going to const errors set errors equals use state with an empty array. We're going to set errors json.errors And we'll do here, we're going to do error dot. We'll set that there. And we'll do it here as well. Now, the only problem is that I don't know what to type here. So, and just to test this, we're going to say we're going to copy the error returned here. Oh. We'll just copy that for some mocking. So what we need to do is that if there's an error in the state, that it should display some message above. So we have the form here, project selection. So there's the form. So we're going to say errors.map error turn. Oh, just do div and the error for now. So to refresh, and we've got our error displaying, but it looks bad. So what we're going to do is each error will need to have a class. So here's where, this is why I like Tailwind, is I don't need to go write some classes. I'm going to put this in a container, MX auto, and I'm going to add some padding of 2. Let's reload this. So I saved, and that should cause a reload in the back end. It is taking a little bit longer to load because I have all of Drupal's caching turned off and xdebug on. So you know what? Let's go ahead and do ddev xdebug off. And the reason I turned off all of Drupal's caching and Twig cache is so that way when I modified Twig templates, it reloaded and it's like you see it instantly. But we're not dealing with any of that right now. So let's turn that to true. So cache true. And inside settings.local, put back on the render cache at least. So ddev drush r, let's kill that. And that should help make the reloading a little bit faster without xdebug on or all the caches being passed from the render cache. There's not much being rendered because it's the JavaScript app, but we all know that Drupal runs faster when it's got its caching in place. Or if you didn't, you now do. So we'll go into here. We want this to have a background red. Let's do red 500, the border red 400, and text white. Save. We should now have a styled error message. Okay. Oh, hold on. Why is this? Oh, let's copy in this max width and add a margin bottom 4. So it's going to reload. And this is taking a lot of time to have to edit and watch the reload. So one of the cool parts about Tailwind is we can just start adding some classes into the DOM inspector. So do px of 4. Not px, we should just do padding of 4 in general. Maybe we do 2 instead. Or px2. We'll try that. All right, I like that better. What I should do is there is some error message, build error message. This might be the code. So I have right here. I should make this reusable, but this is an error message that happens if the build fails. So it's not entirely available. But I am going to copy the classes I have. So let's see what this looks like. All right, so we've got that there. We're going to remove the default and see what happens. Put this back to an empty state. And we'll try to launch, and we're going to see what it looks like when errors actually come through. So this is disabled. We'll just keep that disabled. So, and there's another bug too. I don't know why this happens, but after you launch a project, it like creates a duplicate entry in the system. Some things got weird when I did some of the work on here. So we've got the errors back. It is warning about needing a unique key for each error. So we'll do, I don't know what's the best way to do that. Probably key just key it like the array. But one thing that's annoying is it says should not be blank and should not be null. And that's coming between the fact, that's due to the fact that we have, let me pull up the type data. Drupal version says not blank and is required. So it's annoying because when we set it to required, it checks as long as it's present. But without that, I guess we could drop required. So the difference is if we set required ensures that the property is present in the payload, but not that it has value. Like you could pass a string that's just empty quotes and the required passes. Which is why I had to add not blank. So I think if I remove the required flag, it will have the same, it will protect us against it from being the required, and we'll get rid of some of that duplicate messaging. So we'll test that. So if I went to not blank, so in here, we will check the validator. So allow null. So it says is string. So it checks here to make sure that is blank is almost a better constraint than is not null, which is what required does. So we'll try this again now. Let's do the password toggle. Sure. I'll launch the sandbox. Okay, so now we get one error back. Still a little cryptic, but it's better than what we had, just an error message. So I am going to commit this. But one thing actually I want to check is promise to result is what happens with MDN JavaScript error. What I'm doing here is I'm setting the errors to be the error, but I believe that's just a error object, which we need to get the message from it. So an error object has a name and message. So what we should do is error.name and then error.message. So that way, if there are any problems at hand, we return the same method. So I'm going to stop the watch and run a build. So we don't have like a CI pipeline that's doing that. So I'm going to run build. And then I'm going to push this up and we'll now have some decent errors available for us. Up, connection refused because I killed it. So we'll go back to the main site. So we got that issue done. We have this issue about to be ready. The build takes a little bit because it uses purge CSS. So Tailwind by itself has, it's like 3 megabytes because it's like each CSS property is its own class, which some people are like, well, that's ridiculous. I don't have to write CSS, I just write classes. And then it shakes it loose. So now our CSS is only 9 kilobytes because it only provides the classes that we use. So if I open that up in here, oh, it's got source mapping, or it's been minified. But you can see here it only uses classes that we used instead of the whole kit and caboodle. So let's check what needs to be committed. Yeah, we removed set required so we get a better error. The other ones probably need that too, but we'll leave it at that. So we're going to add modules, add themes. I just want to review the lib changes again. So we're added errors via React hooks for state management. We're setting errors there. We're setting and turning a regular JavaScript error into our message format and setting it as an array. And then we're rendering it. Cool. Oh, that'd be bad to commit. Right there, everything would break. If I committed that, I should just be smarter and review this in the PHP Storm diff browser. Let me resize that so you all can see it okay. Removing payload, we're setting that. Quick demos, remove that log. That's okay to blend into here. And that's okay. Update React code to display message errors. Let's do commit and push. Push it there. Look at the git log just to make sure it should say that it was pushed up. Great. All right, and we see that we got our 2 messages. Woohoo! I'm going to mark this for review. So that's 2 bug fixes, and I think I'm going to go for 1 more before I call it a stream because I have to get some goodies for the Packers and Buccaneers game happening today. Got to get the snacks on. All right, so one thing that we want to do is make sure that when somebody types in a patch that it's from a trusted source. Otherwise, somebody could just install code. Somebody could write a patch that has malicious code in it and host it anywhere and then include it simply.me and try to hack the system. Now, technically, I'm pretty sure that somebody could still upload a malicious file to Drupal.org or malicious patch. And I don't know if Drupal.org has any kind of like file scanning of a patch, but it's a lot safer than just trusting from any outside source. So one thing we need to do is we're going to go to, well, first off, I'm going to get back to the 8.x, 4.x branch. Close that and show where we're going to add that in. So as I've been showing, there's this instance launch definition. And inside of here, we have this project info definition. And this is the array of data that tells us about a project. It says, here's the title of the project, the short name, which is the machine name. So in here, we actually have Symfony has a regex, a regular expression constraint that lets you define a pattern. Drupal core uses this in various areas. We're using it to verify that it is the pattern of a machine name. Pretty sure I just stole this from Drupal for machine name generation as it is. Again, we have it say not blank, and then with the primitive type, and this set required. The type is the extension type, where actually we could set that this has to match an allowed value. We could say to do add constraint for allowed values of module theme profile. So we could even get that specific. So if somebody provides an invalid expected type, it throws a constraint. So we have here, we have our patches property, and we have notes here for something else. So in here, we would want to add a constraint that checks that the patch is from Drupal.org or get.drupalcode.org. So in here, I just want to reread my notes. We use string over URI for better validation control. The URI just returned invalid primitive type. Okay. Don't know. Oh, here we go. Sorry. So it's a list data definition. So it's saying this is a list of strings. And then below it, I need to look a little bit lower. So we get the item definition. So when you do a list data definition, it's a list of this type. We're then saying on the item definition of string, we're going to add a constraint called patches URL. And this patches URL is our own custom constraint here. And what this does is it extends the URL constraint from Symfony, which is a lot nicer than the URI constraint. URI constraint, data type. Let's see if I can find data type URI. So it only runs this primitive type constraint, and it's not a good validation. It says it doesn't do like protocol check. So here we're able to say that we only accept patches that have HTTPS in it. So actually I could do a demo of that right here. So we have the sending patches. We modify this to say HTTP and run the request. Oh, 500. Oh, I need to clear the cache because I changed branches, so the URL the subscriber is broken. Give me 1 second. Our error messages are going to look a little ugly again, but we'll be able to show that if we provide a patch that isn't HTTPS, it gets rejected by the backend service. So I'm going to run the request again. So we get back additional projects. Yep, key 0, which is the first entry, patches, and the first patch is not a valid URL. Little cryptic on the messaging, it doesn't really explain why, but that's just how the default validator works, is it runs against the regex pattern, and if it fails, it returns that message. We can add something that's a little bit more robust later on, but for now, that's good enough for me. So we're going to use this as our testing. So let's change this to, like, if somebody made a phishing site called Drupal, we now need to add validation into the host, and we're going to see if that's even supported by the Symfony validator. So let's go up to the top. So check DNS is deprecated. And the only options are to check the DNS protocol. So we might need to extend the constraint or add a new one. Let's look at this URL validator again. So validate. Pattern checks the there. Okay. So it doesn't do a parse URL to check the host until it does a DNS check. So what we'll do is we're now going to extend the URL validator with our own. And we will now do, shoot, wrong button. So the naming convention is you do the constraint name, so patches URL, and then you add validator at the end of it. And copy this. So we're going to extend the URL validator. And if I delete that here, what is the pattern for this? Do I have to change this to patches URL constraint? There we go. Okay, so you take the name of the class and add validator at the end of it, and then Symfony knows that that's the validator for that class. And using the Symfony bridge plugin, that gives me this navigate to validator and all that. So let's get back into here. So we want to extend validation. Or validate rather. So this context, build validation, add valid violation, return. So we want to go into here, and I'm going to turn Xdebug back on because I work by always running the debugger and step debugging constantly because my brain can't just write some code and get to work without losing track of what I'm trying to do. I've got the host. We're going to say loud host equals Drupal.org. And we need to support get drupalcode.org. And there's a parent issue for this because you're able to fetch patches through GitLab. So like by adding .patch to a commit, it converts a patch to it. So we want to add that domain name. I think specifically with the subdomain, stop is null. So one trick I always do with debugging is I do stop equals null because you can't breakpoint an empty space. So I kind of have that at the end as my empty stop point because it's non-breaking code. Although sometimes I manage to get that committed in various things, and there's all these random stop equal null statements. All right, so let's run the request again. And we have the host was null because the value was empty. All right, well, that's one will have to check that. What does it do if it's null? Hold on. Oh. We'll copy this into here. So that way we don't run if it's an empty value. So that's the URL host. Are we able to get it without the subdomain? I guess technically everything is on Drupal.org, so we test that. Or we'll just add. Yeah, everything is actually served from Drupal.org. So we'll just do www. We'll specify that there. And it looks like we'll do if not in array host loud host true. Stop. We'll copy. We're going to override the message set here. What is the constraint message? We'll say patches must only originate from a Drupal.org domain. All right. Why is this throwing it? Oh, there. We'll close that out. We'll go to this. We're going to play that again. Now step through. So it's not in the array. We got the exception. Play from there. And if we look at our response, we now see that patches must only originate from a Drupal.org domain. So the whole like Symfony constraint system, like if you work with Symfony, you know about it, but inside Drupal, it's buried so deep. It's so deep beneath like all the stack that not many folks know about it or type data. The type like entities are type data definitions, but you work with entities and fields. But entities contain type data definitions, which are fields, and fields are type data definitions, and it just throws the whole way down. Like this is working with it at a very base layer, and it's really powerful. You know, one of the things I love about Drupal is its data modeling, and if you get to just one entities in the UI for building data models, but then at this layer with type data definitions and being able to validate them, it's very robust. It's just most people never get to venture this far down to leverage it. So I'm glad to hear that you're learning something new. That's kind of the points of this. Like I don't really have like a full agenda. I know I'm going to touch a whole bunch of stuff, and hopefully, you know, somebody learns something neat and new that they can try to use in their own projects, or just even see the way I think and use that to help them themselves on something else. Set code, I don't know what. Yeah, we'll just leave that there. So I don't have testing set up for this specifically. Yes, I do. Never mind. Tests. Launch definition test. Always write tests, and don't forget that you wrote tests. Which I broke the test, maybe not in here. So let me run this. All right. Is this a unit test or it's a kernel test? Why is it a kernel test? We don't need a kernel test for this. Oh, we do. So here's an explanation why this is a kernel test. So as I said earlier in the stream, unit tests are just like a regular PHP unit test, and a kernel test bootstraps part of Drupal. And with Drupal, the type data system requires discovery because it's a plugin system. And the plugin system means that Drupal has to be installed at some level and capacity to do definition discovery and various other things. You can work around it, but making it a kernel test keeps using some of those the system works as it's supposed to, so you get a better testing experience. Service not found, tugboat as all. Okay. Simply test. One click demo. Let me try to get these tests back up and running again, because again, they're a little out of sync as to some of the recent changes. But in here, we have our main test, which tests the validation. So it takes the data and any expected violations and runs that, and we have our data provider. So here's like the general one of yield a project name that's empty, and we get should not be blank, should not be null. We have one here that, this should be fine and yield no errors. Eventually this could yield an error because this isn't a valid install profile. Like we could add checks for that. Invalid short name. There's a question mark in there that's not allowed. This is a more robust one with additional projects, no errors. Here we go. We got a patches error, so that it's not a valid URL because it's a local path. And here we have one that says HTTP and FTP validates that those are invalid protocols. And then we have this one. This used to pass, but it doesn't anymore. Because patches must only originate from a Drupal.org domain. So let's go ahead and collapse this. We'll find out what the other errors are in a second. Org and get that Drupal code.org. Run that there. Oh, wrong runner. One thing I will add as a note, if somebody knows how to do a lot of these same things in VS Code, I would love to know. I do use VS Code here and there because it is pretty powerful. Like I'll use VS Code when I'm writing Go or Rust or JavaScript, but like PHP, it's fine. Like it works, but there's just the things in PHP Storm with like the Symfony integration, like when you have like routing files and services, that YAML, like being able to click and jump to things that resolve off that text is critical. So if somebody knows of a VS Code that does provide those Symfony like flavors or those nice little touches, I would love to hear about it so I can play around. So I'll play this again and we'll see if we can get. So this one should pass. Oh no, shoot, I wrote this in the wrong area. So that one should always pass, but this one should always fail because those are not valid domains. So I need to wait for this to run. So as you can see, the kernel tests are way slower. I mean, each one is taking about 3 seconds, but that's just because inside the kernel test base, it's doing a basic install of minimal tables and doing some discovery. So it takes a bit. So we have set 4, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's failing. This is not, okay. So it has 2 validation errors. One that it's not a valid URL, and it must originate from Drupal.org. That's a bit repetitive. So what we should do is, let's see. Is there a way to check if we have let's see. Get violations is, so we'll just do, so if count is greater than 0, return it is already invalid. Okay, so we're just going to skip it. If it's already invalid, we're not going to bother running this as well, such as like it has a bad port, or not port, it has a bad protocol. That's the word. All right, so now our other test is passing. And that test is passing now. Because we modified it that, we updated this test case that should only originate from Drupal.org. What's this? Oh. Let's go through 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay. Why? It's only showing the error once. There's 2 values. That's odd. I would think that it would run multiple errors, one for each value, but maybe it doesn't go through each value if the first one's wrong. I want to test this real quick. Drupal.org. Let's see. Fail to assume the 2 arrays are equal. So expected 1, it was 0. Okay, so maybe if the first value is wrong, it doesn't iterate through everything. Kind of wish it would go through a little bit more, but it is what it is. So I'm just going to run all these tests again real quick. And I believe we can then push it up. Let's see. We could do regular expression here. And it could be configurable. I don't know if it needs to be configurable though, because how often do the domain names don't really change? And I guess I don't think Drupal.org allows access without the www anymore. We can test that fairly quickly though. If we do curl I Drupal.org, move permanently to HTTPS, which again says 301 to HTTPS www. We'll throw it up. I don't think we should do a regular expression. Kind of like just parsing it and getting the host, because some have asked for other patch sources like GitHub or GitLab domains. All right, so basically making it available for whitelisting or allowed listing, so that way an organization could have access. Okay, so what we could do, all right, let's get creative with it then. So right now, I'm going to find myself. So we have it where we're parsing this URL. So I like the idea then of parsing the URL to get the host and checking the allowed list. But this allowed list should be configurable. So I want, there's no way to inject, hold on. I want to see something real quick. Constraint validate. Extract. Path alias construct. Ah, great. We can do container injection. All right. So let's implement container injection interface. We're gonna try to teach some more things. So when you implement container injection interface, various parts of Drupal code will check, hey, does this implement this interface? If it does, call this create method with the current container and allow it to build itself. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a new allowed hosts public function struct array of allowed hosts. So we're going to do something fun. Now, this should go into config, which I completely agree with, but one pattern that I've been using is actually using service parameters instead of config for everything. So we're going to add new service parameters for this. We do parameters. We do simply test launch allowed hosts. We're going to say www.drupal.org and get.drupal.org. And we'll do container get parameter simply test launch, and instead of making it a sub thing, let's just do that. Load host. Oh. So now we set that there, and we're going to say this allowed hosts. So we've now made it configurable. And I say somewhat because we could go through our site, and that's what this, if you ever wonder what default.services.yaml is for, this lets you configure service parameters. So inside of core.services.yaml, you go up to the top. Can't scroll hard enough. Here's all these parameters, and you're able to override these in the same way that you'd be able to override these parameters. So you could have in your site's default services.yaml, simply test.allowed host and override per environment if you wanted to. But we're going to take it to a whole step above that in a second. First, right, we modified our code. We changed how we determined the allowed host. Got to run the tests. Yeah, make sure we didn't get a regression in our tests. And while that runs, I'm going to fix up my code and be a good developer and follow coding standards. Let's see, array, it's not just an array, it's a string array, the allowed hosts for patches. So that. Usually constructors are constructs a new blah object, the allowed hosts for patches. Okay. Woohoo. So it's still passing. Now if I read this root issue again, allow possible admins to configure it. So it's cool, we've got it in a service container, but there's no way to edit it. The way we could work around it is by injecting configuration, or by injecting the config factory and fetching config for it. But we can still make that be a possibility. One thing I want to do, I didn't open a branch for this yet. Let me take a snapshot of this by making an issue fork and pushing the code up. So open the merge request, and while that's running, add the fork there. Check this out. So I'll use the built-in get viewer. So yep, we got our service parameter there. Fixed up the test, added test. I'm going to remove this to do because we don't want to actually commit that, although it'd be a neat add. Remove what it's validated by. So you can specify what validates something by giving it an explicit class name or the naming pattern. And we now have something that matches the naming pattern, so we'll use that. All right, we're gonna update patches URL constraint to check hosts. So I'll push that. So now we'll add a config form for this, and like all great ideas, they are borrowed. So this idea is borrowed from the JSON API extras module. We go into the event subscriber and config subscriber. So what they do here is whenever you save a config and it's the JSON API extras, it's actually used to modify the container parameters. Wait. Unsaved. This isn't where I remember it being though. Let's get router builder. When path prefix is changed, somewhere it used to do this in here. Where did I do this before? This event is changed path prefix, rebuild the container. So it used to set the parameter in here. Oh, sorry, I'm dumb. Never mind. Never mind. It's not in the event subscriber. It's in the service provider here. So it loads the Bootstrap config factory. It gets the config, and then it sets the parameter. Sorry. So you create your configuration, and then whenever that configuration is saved, you rebuild the container, and then you can use that to set your config values into the container as service parameters. So I like that approach because you're not loading config, it's automatically into the container, so it's compiled for you and it's less loading of config. So to do that, we first have to now make config schema, and we have to do simply test launch.schema.yaml. So it would be like, what would it be? Simply test launch.settings. Type config object. I think it's label. Since we've got JSON API extras open right here, I am going to it's config entity. Set label simply test launch settings. There you go, mapping, right? Mapping, and then we have allowed hosts, which is type sequence, right? Yep, sequence, and then label is hosts. And then you do sequence, and then the type is string. So we have that. And then we should do file install. We want simply, actually no, I'm gonna leave that. I'm gonna make the directory, but I'm gonna leave it. So we need an install directory, and we're going to update our setup here. So setup. So this is going to fail right away once we get this rolling, and I'll explain why shortly. This install config. So one thing that we're doing is we're replacing the services with config. So actually I should delete that. So if I delete that and I run the test, everything is going to fail. Or, well, not everything, but just the URL validation test. So now we need to work to get our test green with this configuration. So if I go ahead now and do simply test launch.settings.yaml, do allowed hosts, www.drupal.org. You can do get.drupalcode.core.org. So as you'll see, we're getting non-existent parameter. So the parameter doesn't exist. So we're getting test failures. So we'll leave that as an empty array for now too. So what we'll do is we're going to add a container. We're going to add a service provider, which those you add by doing your module name and camel case. So in this case, it's simply test launch, remove the underscore, capitalize L, and then we do service provider. We add it Drupal namespace, simply test launch. And then we do class simply test, and we extend the provider base, service provider base, and we want to override the alter method. Inherit the document. So let's go ahead and we're going to copy this setting right here. Bootstrap config factory, which what this does here is before the system's fully booted up, it gets you the right configuration storage, which falls back to the database. The database connection has been set, but Drupal's not fully booted. So it allows, and that setting allows you to provide alternative config storage locations. So we have the settings. If settings so I like being explicit. So if is array and is set settings allowed hosts. Actually, not even that. We don't need to do that. We'll do is array allowed hosts equals settings allowed hosts, and we'll use the what symbol to provide default values. So then we do container set parameter to simply test launch allowed hosts is allowed hosts. Actually, we expect this all the time. So we will paste that here. I'll say if is array settings is an array. We'll provide some defaults that way. All right, let's run the test again, and we should get a better error, one that says that this parameter doesn't exist, but just one that says a failure because we're not able to validate. So that's going. We're going to add our event subscriber. We'll do event subscriber, big subscriber, PHP. Getting kind of worried that no tests are failing. Oh. Okay. Where's launch definition test? I'm kind of concerned that this didn't error. Oh, it didn't work as expected. So we're going to just keep pushing forward to get it to pass as expected. So simply test launch, event subscriber, final class config subscriber. See, is there any more goodies we can just borrow from JSON API extras? Nope, you just implement event subscriber interface. Make sure you pick the Symfony one. Implement get subscriber events. There's no harm in ever copying code that you know exists. So config events, we import that. Make a public function on save, which has the, copy that. It is the config CRUD event. Config CRUD event. Let's see here. Oh, that's interesting. Check if it's installed or not. So we'll do if event get config name. Whoop. All right, get name equal to simply test launch dot settings. That's triple kernel. Okay. So we need to inject the kernel. Function construct. Drupal kernel, Drupal, right? Drupal kernel interface. Kernel. This Drupal kernel is Drupal kernel. Oh. The Drupal kernel structs a new blah object. Add this here. Now, in all honesty, I've stopped usually adding code elements to my properties and a constructor because it doesn't really add much, especially now that we have so much type hinting. Since we have so much type hinting, it makes sense. And like, honestly, does this string of text really add any more context than the name of the class does? So I've become kind of a purist that the documentation doesn't always need to be there, because especially when it's so self-explanatory. So then we need to say this Drupal rebuild container. So we're saying that whenever this changes, we should rebuild the container, but we should probably do event is changed allowed hosts. So we should only do that when that actually changes. As it's merged into parent, great. Whoa, that made it all kinds of weird formatting though. Hold on, let me clean that up. This is flip. Technically that is, it's faster to check if the, what's up here, what's going on? So first we check if the key that was changed is allowed hosts. and that if it was for our config, and if it was, we rebuild the container, the event, react to config saving. So if we run this again, second, gotta see. Okay. Oh, should have just ran the failed. So it should fail again, especially since I deleted the services file and then add this in. So we got to do simply test launch.services.yaml. Do services. We'll do simply test launch.config subscriber. Do the class of config subscriber. Autocomplete that. Oh, here's one reason I love the Symfony plugin too, the Drupal bridge. So if I did command enter, which is like clicking the light bulb, and I did Symfony YAML argument. Oh. Well, usually it generates it properly if it's not an obscure. I'm pretty sure it's the HTTP kernel. But usually it automatically determines what is the argument to add into there. But in this case, the kernel's weird. Oh, so it's just at kernel. And we got a tag as a name. This is one thing that's nice too. So when you're doing tag services, there's a bunch of tags that are available. And as you start typing, it auto-completes it. And if you want to do a command click, it even finds all the other things that are tagged the same. So again, pretty big lifesaver for productivity when using PHP Storm. So that makes it worth the cost. I know some people, that's the argument, like VS Code's free, PHP Storm, you have to pay money. Yeah, pay money, but it pays for itself in productivity, and also they fund PHP development by employing a core contributor. So I like knowing my money goes there. So invalid argument and for each. And this, let's see if we can figure it out in the stack. What did I do? Get subscribed to events. Oh, well, if you write an event subscriber, you need to actually return your subscribed events. That's helpful and prevents crashes. So let me run that again. All right, so we got an error, but it's not the error that we're expecting. So now let's give it the good test. So if we modify this to say www.drupal.org and get.drupalcode.org, we save it, we would have a passing test. And if not, then I did something wrong. So we're going to debug our test. Yeah, that's the test there. So with PHP Storm, you're able to debug tests, but Drupal tests run in isolation. And when it's run in isolation, for the life of me, I can never get it to connect unless I turn on always run. So one thing that I do is override this run test in separate process, and I set it to false. Your test will always fail because state changes, but it does allow Xdebug to kick in properly. Because when it's in a separate process, it actually forks a sub-process and things get weird. So settings is false there. Let's see if this runs again. Okay, so it ran again. Settings, allowed hosts. set the parameter. One thing I want to do now is go to the constraint, and we're going to see if we can figure out what happened here. So allowed hosts, we have our allowed hosts that are correct. So there's no constraint there. Why? Get. Oh. So this allowed host, I just have, oh, DrupalCore.org. That's all right. I failed the test because I don't know how to type properly. So let's remove this line of code and run that failed test again. And it should pass. Yes, great. So let's run everything once more. And then our last step would be adding the a form. But I'm running low on time, so we're going to save that for a follow-up. But what we were able to do is create a config, and whenever that config saves, we rebuild the service container, and we're able to then take that and push it into the service container as a parameter, and that allows us to have those hosts be compiled as a parameter versus having to load that config every single time we need to check it, which can be a performance boost in some ways. One thing I want to do is ensure that this value is always set and never empty. So I'm going to run that again once I made that change, and I'll push this up. So now if we wanted to, like, we could ship this, and it's one that it could be edited by doing, let me open a new terminal so it's easier to see. So we could add a config form or just do drush cedit simply test launch.settings. And this would allow us to edit that settings file and then save it. It would recompile the container and it would deploy. Obviously, the full fix is to add a form. But unfortunately, I wish we had a way to say, like, hey, build a form based off the schema, but Drupal core doesn't have that quite yet. So I'm just going to wait for these tests to pass. I'm going to commit it and pop the pull the merge request into review. And I'll let Adam decide if we should merge this with or without the form to start, unless I get to it later today. So let me just review the code. So, okay, we got our default allowed hosts. We've got our schema set. We've got the services defined. Our test installs the config, because otherwise it would just do nothing. We've added our event subscriber and the compiler pass. Was this a bit more difficult than just saying, hey, load the config? Yeah, a bit. But, you know, I just feel that we're able to take things and pre-compile it. So instead of having to load that config dynamically every single time, you know, it's just here. It's there. It's always known. Because otherwise we'd have to load that config for every single chance that we have to validate, and that's performance loss. Like, every time you have to do something, you lose performance. But if you can compile it into the state of the container, you just have it all the time. So add setting for managing the allowed hosts. So I'll do a commit and push. And so if we reload this here then for this validate URLs, we'll see the 2 commits. I'm going to kick it over to needs review. And there we go. So I didn't get to this maintain a cache of a local cache of Drupal core releases. Maybe I'll do that next week on a live stream. But we did get at least this fixed up where it wasn't respecting the umami install. Now we actually get errors that are displayed if something goes wrong on launching. And I think this is a big one, is validating patch URLs are from Drupal.org web properties. That's a good security issue and adds the flexibility. So that's what we got. Thanks for tuning in. I hope you learned something and a little bit about how I do work and kind of debug and track things. And, if you do want to support SimplyTest development, you can go to opencollective.com/simplytest.me and become a contributor. All the money goes back into maintenance costs and hosting costs. I will be donating time of my own to help get this over the edge because I think it's a vital tool to the Drupal community. And thanks for tuning in. Have a good day.